one landscape, one people, one fire. But the moment flames cross the 49th parallel, the legal ground changes. In late July 2023, the Eagle Bluff wildfire crossed from Washington state into British Columbia and forced an evacuation order for the border town of Syilx. That town sits 3.6 kilometers north of the line. Before 1846, there was no border here. Colonization in the 1800s split the Syilx Okanagan people's ancestral lands through the creation of the 49th parallel and the Canada-United States border in 1846, separating the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington state from the rest of the nation in British Columbia. The line did not follow a mountain pass or a river, it simply ran through the same territory. Today the Okanagan Nation Alliance spans roughly 69,000 square kilometers and unites 7 Syilx bands in British Columbia with the Colville Confederated Tribes, which has about 9,520 enrolled members. Syilx, the southernmost town in British Columbia's Okanagan Valley, sits 3.6 kilometers north of the United States border. In 2021, it had a population of 5,556, and 43% were seniors. Just north of that line, the Syilx Indian Band controls roughly 32,000 acres of land and has about 540 band members living and working on the reserve. That makes the border more than a political idea, it is close enough to define the fire protection of an aging town. On the ground, the border is not an ecological boundary. The United States Environmental Protection Agency's ecoregion framework divides North America into 15 Level I ecological regions and 182 Level 3 regions used for environmental monitoring, assessment, and management. Those regions follow climate, soils, and vegetation, not the 49th parallel. The same ponderosa pine forest, the same dry grass, the same wind runs from Washington state into British Columbia. But the line becomes a wall when fire starts. A fire engine's authority, an evacuation order's legal force, a water tender's access route, and an insurance policy's coverage are all tied to jurisdiction. The land may be continuous, but the response is not. This is the central contradiction. An invisible line on the ground becomes hard the moment it is crossed. For the Syilx, that line was never a natural boundary, it was an administrative cut through one territory. A fire can cross in minutes. The legal handoff can take much longer. That delay is not a failure of individual crews, it is the design of two separate systems meeting at the 49th parallel. Fire itself is not new here. What is new is the suppression regime that stopped the old cycle. Canada has generally stopped performing controlled burns, and it is especially difficult for Indigenous groups, who historically performed them and are disproportionately affected by wildfires, to obtain permission. That means the landscape accumulates dry fuel instead of being opened by low-intensity burns. On one side of the border, a Syilx practitioner can face one set of rules, across the line, another set. The knowledge is continuous, but the permission is not. The border not only splits the nation, it splits fire management. This is the valve that should have released pressure, but it was closed by regulation. A controlled burn can reduce fuels on a hillside, but crossing a boundary can change the legal category of that same fire. When the ignition came in 2023, the system was already brittle. The landscape was not just ready to burn, it was managed into a state where any spark could become a cross-border event. The pressure did not stay hidden. On Monday, June 5, 2023, 413 wildfires were burning across Canada, and about 10,000 people had been forced from their homes in Quebec alone. Quebec's Wildfire Prevention Agency, SOPVU, reported that more than 173,000 hectares had burned in the province's intensive protection zone in 2023, against a 10-year average of 247 hectares for the same date. That was not just a local anomaly. By October 6, 2023, the season had burned 184,961 square kilometers of Canada, about 5% of the country's entire forest area and more than 6 times the long-term average, making it the most area burned in Canada's recorded history. Between 185,000 and 232,000 people were displaced, and 8 firefighters were killed. Smoke from those fires drifted south into the United States, and nearly 100 million people across North America experienced very poor air quality. The border did not contain smoke, but it still contained response. In this boom, the 49th parallel was not a barrier to the fire, it was a seam in the response. In late July 2023, the Eagle Bluff wildfire crossed the 49th parallel from Washington state into British Columbia. It forced an evacuation order for the border town of Syilx. The town sits minutes north of the United States border. The fire had almost no distance left to travel before it reached homes. Syilx itself became a legal entity only on January 14, 1946, when it was incorporated as a village municipality, and it was reincorporated as a town municipality on June 30, 1983. By the time Eagle Bluff crossed, the town was a Canadian municipality facing an American fire. That shift changed command, equipment, and legal responsibility at the exact moment speed mattered most. The fire did not carry a passport, but the response had to follow one. The border is not physical, but it is procedural. A crew from Washington state can see the flames. Whether it can legally act across the line is a separate question. This was not a failure of one side. It was the design of a hard line drawn through a continuous fire landscape. United States President Joe Biden called the 2023 Canadian wildfires a stark reminder of the impacts of climate change and said the United States had deployed more than 600 firefighters to help battle the blazes. That help crossed the line, but it was emergency mutual aid, not shared jurisdiction. The deeper work is less cinematic. It is about rebuilding a cross-border fire culture that the 1846 line interrupted. The Syilx Okanagan Nation Alliance already unites 7 bands in British Columbia with the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington state, not as 2 nations, but as one nation divided by a line. Their next front is not the fire itself, it is the permission to manage fire before it becomes a wall. The line drawn in 1846 still controls response, but the people split by it are rebuilding as though the land is whole. The question is no longer only who responds, but whose knowledge is allowed to prevent the next fire. Where the next resources go will determine whether that line can be softened before the next Eagle Bluff. The border did not cause the fire, but it still shapes who is protected when the land burns. For the Syilx, protection cannot stop at the 49th parallel. The next season's planning is now moving toward landscape-scale fire management that ignores the line where it can. The real contest is no longer about where the line is. It is about whether an indigenous nation can make that line disappear in the places where survival depends on it. That is the hidden system, not the fire, but the line. And the next decision is not about the next flame, it is about the next map.